Hello?
Yes, sir. Please go.
Are you?
Thank you for the opportunity. I hope that you're listening to me well. First of all, Mr. Gerard, I would like to just make an amendment of your introduction to me. I'm not from Greece. I'm from Republic of Macedonia, which is a different state in Europe. So greetings from Europe. And we had a long dispute in international matters with Greece about the name issue. Maybe some of you know about it. So it's a very sensitive matter. Thanks for the opportunity again for giving me this opportunity to just speak on the matters that matter to me and my career at most, the international law. Maybe the private part of the international law is more important for me because it's mainly a legal matter, but also the public international law is interesting for the audience today, probably because it matters what is mostly here on the news, on the subject of the mainstream media all the time, and most of the people know about the international law in the public matter, not in the private matter. So I will try to explain the different parts of this ambiguation, because it is very different what is private international law, what is public international law, and what matters to the ordinary person most. As I was told by you, today's subject will be contemporary issues of international law as a result of globalization, which will be the primary subject of my coming to you to do today, and probably for the most part it will be for the public international law way of thinking, because most of the problems are problems between states and international organizations. I will try to differentiate this at the start and the first 10 minutes of my lecture, because it is important, because you said to me that most of the audience will be not very used to speaking about international matters. Maybe some of them will learn the basics about international law. So I will try to keep an eye on the globalization issue, which is some kind of trend in these years, maybe with this COVID pandemic and some of the issues that have arisen after the Brexit and after the maybe there's a trend of a retrograde trend of globalization. Some anti-global movements have risen up. So it's an interesting subject to talk about. But a vast network of international law and dozens of international organizations make the globalization possible, because those international organizations make treaties and other types of agreements among countries, and they set rules for international trade and finance. Some of them are very famous, like the GATT, which are mostly economical ones. Others are for fostering cooperation on protecting the environment, such as the Kyoto Protocol, which was established 2 years ago. Then some are for establishing basic human rights, like it is the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which is part of the UN Accord. Meanwhile, among many international organizations, the United Nations as the most important international organizations in the public international law spectrum, facilitates international diplomacy. The World Health Organization coordinates international public health, as we could see in the recent months. And the International Labour Organization monitors and fosters workers' rights around the world. These are just a few of the many international organizations which are working on a supranational level, working to combine the efforts towards one dedicated goal of the organization. The scope and authority of international law have thus expanded dramatically during the era of globalization. Historically, international law addressed only relations between countries or states in certain limited areas, and the subjects were usually about war and diplomacy. It was dependent on the sovereignty and territorial boundaries of distinct countries. I'm trying to just use the nomenclature appropriate for India, because as I know, India is some kind of federation. So when I'm talking about countries, I'm talking, for example, like India as a whole. your independent states doesn't matter at all in the international level. So I'm talking about India at all. So when I'm talking about state, it is as India. But globalization has changed international law in numerous ways. For example, as globalization has accelerated, international law has become a vehicle for states to cooperate regarding new areas of international relations, such as environment and human rights, which are more famous because of the institutions founded by them. Many of them requiring states to rethink the previous notions of the sovereign state. The continued growth of international law is even more remarkable in this sense, since states having undoubtedly weighted the costs and benefits of the loss of this valuable sovereignty have still chosen to continue the growth of international law. Because of the need of enhanced international, or some call it transnational cooperation, globalization has therefore given new meanings to classic issues. Questions of authority of a country within its borders, that is its state sovereignty, the role of the individual in the international community of nation states, and the authority of international organizations have all evolved in the light of forces of globalization. This is important to just recognize, especially if you're coming from Europe, as I am, because, for example, in some of the most important human rights are chartered in some continental document, which is binding for all the European countries. So, for example, for me as a natural being, a natural person, that European Conventions on Human Rights and the Court for Human Rights is establishing some of the boundaries which even my state, the state which I live in, is dependent on, and they must obey, which is some kind of intrusion of the sovereign matters. As I recall, you don't have such matters in India because you're in Asia and you don't have that kind of cooperation, international cooperation. But as the globalization intensifies, maybe in some way in the future, you will get to that stage of the international laws establishment. So basically, defined international law is simply the set of rules that countries follow in dealing with each other. There are three distinct legal processes that can be identified in international law that include public international law, which is the relationship between the sovereign states and the international entities, such as International Criminal Court, for example. Also, there is the private international law, which is addressing questions of jurisdictions in conflict, mostly dependent on the natural persons or legal persons that are part of that conflict. And also there's the supranational national law, which is the set of collective laws that sovereign states voluntarily yield to, which is they took part of it. But this basic definition must be supplemented with three more complex explanations. So the first one is international law really a law, a classic, in the classic sense of law? The way, for example, the laws in India are enforced by court and police, which is not the case. Where do we find the rules of international law, which is also a difficult question to answer. And the third one is, are they written down somewhere, or how is the international law enforced if there is no world government? So these are continuous questions asked by many scholars during the last century and a half. They were the reason for forming the League of Nations between the two world wars. Then they were the reason for forming the United Nations organization and all the other organizations on international level. So there are several ways to think about law. In international law, in the domestic legal system, we think of law as the rules that the government issues to control the life of its citizens. As maybe I didn't just quite catch what the previous speaker was talking about, because I didn't know the language, but it was simply a domestic law interference, you know. So partly it can be talked about in a general sense level, in an international level, but always things like that will be part of the domestic law. Those rules are generally created by the legislature, interpreted by the judiciary, and enforced by the executive branch, especially in those countries that are with divisions of the power, constitutional systems. So, using the police if necessary to force the citizens to obey. But in the international law, as you can see, there is no one legislature organ, there is no one judiciary organ, and there isn't any executive branch. Also, there isn't any police force. We hope so. Everything in international law is part of an agreement, and everything is part of obeying on a rule that everybody just accepts to be true, to be formal. So just as certain common understandings between children may make it easier for them to play when they are playing, and there are no written rules for the game they are playing, collective agreement on certain rules can often serve the interest of all the members of the community. Just as on a playground without a teacher, in an international settings, there is no central authority. Even the Security Council in the United Nations is not a central authority for the international order. So for the most part, however, states will follow the rules they have agreed to follow, because it makes those interactions easier for all parties involved. The most important reason why they follow those rules is the shaming, the public shaming, because when one country is considered by the international community to not obey the international rule standards, it has a public shaming about it, and in the diplomatic sense is like just being stranded and nobody will play with you. So it comes with damages in the international export and import of goods, and other disadvantages for the country. I can say about the example of North Korea just to just show you how can some situation like that be done. In the context of sources of international law, since there is no world government, there is no world congress or parliament or any other kind of body which will make the international law the way domestic legislatures create laws for one country. There are international institutions like the United Nations, which can form some kind of bodies who will represent some consensual agreements between the countries who signed them, and some of them even on a more broader scale. And at the same time, as stated in the statute of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the rules of international law can be found in customary state practice, the general principles of law common to many countries, domestic judicial decisions, and the legal scholarships. The most important of all the sources of international law are the treaties, because the treaties are similar to contracts between the countries, where promises between states are exchanged, finalized in writing, and the states can then afterwards debate on the interpretation or implementations of the treaty. But there are rules of what makes a treaty, which is part of the Vienna Convention on the law of treaties, which is a treaty itself. So there are a lot of treaties out there. Some of them
Ratko, a couple
bilateral,
of quick questions from what you were speaking. So we have a question that, so I'll just read that question out to you. Does the UNICEF work efficiently against carbon emission? And do they regulate it? Is there any common thing which internationally everybody follows?
As I understood the question, UNICEF is about the childcare, and preventing child abuse. So it's a
Okay.
United Nations organization, a branch of United Nations, which is dedicated to the development and care of the children's rights. But the carbon emissions are part of the Kyoto Protocol, which is not signed
Okay.
by some of the most important economies in the world, and maybe it will be an unsuccessful document, unsuccessful treaty in the future. Because yeah.
The next question is there any common international law for immigrants and migrant workers?
Yeah, in many of the international conventions about the movement of citizens, there are some articles about that. So the fusion of all the conventions about the matter combined makes the international humanitarian law, which is the branch, the discipline of the international part of the public international law and also private international law, which is dedicated to those kind of questions. It's not a one convention. There are a lot of them. There are a lot of legal documents, and also it depends for which country in the world are the immigrants heading to, or which is the immigrant country. Because, for example, if you're talking about the Germany or some other country on European level, there are also some regional documents which are dealing with the matter, which are not important if you're trying to immigrate, for example, in Russia or in India, because they have different kind of documents. So it's an interesting matter, and I would just advise the person who made the question to just maybe just contact me on a direct scale via email or something to just
Wonderful. One more question, Ratko. The import and export law and the taxation policy varies from country to country. So if there is a dispute within two companies from different countries, how does the law take its course?
Which this is the question which is mostly close to my heart when I'm speaking about law, because that's exactly the premise of the private international law, which is answering the question for the first thing, which country will be which will have the jurisdiction over the matter. And the other question is about the law that will be the relevant one in that matter. For example, it can happen in some kind of situations. So to have Indian courts to have jurisdiction over some matter, but there are some situations where, for example, if a Japanese company has a contract with an Indian company to just have an export-import thing, that maybe some of the Japanese law will be interpreted by the Indian law, Indian courts in that kind of matter. It's a very, very broad subject. It's very decided case by case, because also there are a lot of bilateral agreements which, or also multilateral agreements which are solving the matter of judicial conflict or the conflict of laws. So, like the previous question, I would just advise the person to just tell me the problem, and I would try to solve it on a particular level.
One last question, Ratko, to you. Do you think that the United Nations organization should play a vital role in enforcing the nations to abide by the conventions promulgated by them? And is the countries following these rules?
Well, it's an interesting question, which will be like, I don't know if you have the saying about the chicken and the egg, which one is older. So it's the same with this matter, because every matter that is solved in international laws way is partly just shrinking the sovereignty of the states. And the sovereignty of the states just gives the international law the meaning they have. So it's a complex question. in order for the United Nations to have more power in deciding the matters on international level, the individual countries should just give up of the sovereign level laws they have and sovereignty they have. So maybe I don't think that as a humanity we are already at that level of thinking. Maybe one day we will be, but now I don't think that in the near term or long term, in the next 50 years, we'll be there.
Thank you very much, Ratko, for explaining about international law and trade and how it goes around the world. Thank you for sparing a wonderful time and joining with us this evening and enlightening us and all the participants. On behalf of our institution, myself, and all the other speakers, I would like to thank you for being with us today, Ratko.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.